Good evening, and welcome to Making Churches Both Embodied and Accessible, a PLOW event. I'm Katrin Kuiper. I'm with PLOW. I'm honored to be joined by Victoria Reynolds Farmer, Jenna Klaassen, Brittany Petruzzi, and Aimee Murphy here tonight. So the reason for this event is there's been some discussion lately of including disabled people in church. It was recently kicked off by an op-ed that suggested that although online services have been a godsend throughout the pandemic, perhaps we need a nudge to get back into community with each other by turning off the computer and going back to church. The major piece of feedback to that was it's still really not safe for a lot of people who are immunocompromised or have other conditions. And what this touched off is the fact that the exclusion of disabled people from church community doesn't begin or end with the pandemic, but goes back farther still. And this would be a great opportunity to talk through that and try to make it better and make it right. So PLOW recently published an issue on disability, which many of our contributors here were a part of. Victoria wrote a beautiful essay called Mary's Song. Jenna also wrote a complimentary online essay called Sparring with Emily Dickinson about the good life. And Aimee and Victoria were both on our podcast series, which I'd encourage you to check out. And Brittany has a piece forthcoming in the next issue, which is dropping in a couple of weeks, on making music. So we wanted to hear from them both in their experiences of church. What are some of the gaps that have been overlooked? And also, what are some positive examples of things that have gone pretty well and that people might go and do likewise? So for everybody who submitted a comment already, thank you so much. Some really thoughtful comments and questions. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. Just know if we don't, your comments are on our hearts as we go out and continue the work past this evening. And also, as you listen in, feel free to type in a question in the YouTube chat, and we'll try to include those too. And with that, Victoria, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here with everyone. I want to start just by introducing ourselves a little bit as far as we are all women living at the intersection of faith and disability. So I wanted to start off by placing ourselves at that intersection, tell everyone a little bit about what that looks like for you, as much about your disability as you're willing to share, your faith tradition, and how those things come together to affect how you go through the world. Who would like to start?
I guess I will. I am Brittany Petruzzi. I grew up in mostly Reformed and Presbyterian, though more recently sort of Reformed Anglican traditions, and very recently went blind as of last year. So I'm still discovering what that means for me and my congregations, and we're kind of discovering it together. So it's been really cool, I think.
Thank you. Jenna, how about you?
All right. I'm Jenna. I have what's called muscular dystrophy, facioscapulohumeral muscular dystrophy, if you want to be fancy. I grew up in the church. I could say I inherited my disability and my faith from my family. I grew up in kind of like a small Baptist-y but non-denominational church in Oklahoma. Stayed there till I was probably 18-ish, and then moved on to a couple of other also non-denominational churches wherever I was living at the time. Did go to one officially Baptist church for a little while, but recently, over the last summer, joined a Presbyterian church. So I've been there for several months now. Muscular dystrophy, if you don't know what that is, it's like a progressive muscular degeneration disease. I've showed signs since I was about 10 years old, which started very minor, but my parents knew what to look for since obviously I have a family history. And so this has kind of been a slowly progressing disability, minimal at first and fairly limiting now. I don't use a wheelchair, but I'm semi-ambulatory. And so it's been kind of a different journey at different times of life. So yeah.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, Aimee?
So my name's Aimee Murphy. I work with the Consistent Life Ethic organization, Rehumanize International, and actually came back to my faith as an adult. I was raised Catholic, and really decided in my early 20s that that was the faith background that I wanted to pursue for several years, like being an atheist and agnostic. I have, I guess, like a fairly relatively new disability. I was diagnosed within the last 4 years with fibromyalgia and a hypermobility spectrum disorder, along with my my small slew of like mental health issues. So yeah, I guess it's a new experience for me, and I'm coming into it and like trying to exist in a space of learning and curiosity about how I can also like learn from and help the disability movement, especially because I'm a little bit of a newbie. So.
Great. Your organization does amazing work. I've been checking them out and sharing them with people at my church too. So I'm really glad to get to know you more tonight as well.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So I was raised Southern Baptist, and I have spastic diplegic cerebral palsy, which means that I walk with a bit of an awkward gait. I'm mostly ambulatory. I am a wheelchair user on vacation and things that like are make me walk more than normal, but typically ambulatory. Like I said, raised Southern Baptist in a really loving congregation, but recently, about a year and a half ago, converted to Catholicism as an adult, primarily because I was really drawn to sacramental theology because of its embodied nature. This idea that the sacraments are physicalized, and they really made me deal with my body and its holiness, even though it is messy and uncontrollable and all of the things that bodies are. So that's where I'm coming from there. So this event came about primarily because the New York Times published an op-ed by Tish Harrison Warren that ruffled some feathers both within the church and without. So let's talk a little bit about what that op-ed said and why we think people kind of got so up in arms about it. Would someone like to just summarize a couple of the main points?
Okay, I will. If I were going to summarize what Tish Harrison Warren said in this op-ed, I would say she calls for kind of a phasing out of online church services, primarily as a means of combating like a consumeristic mindset among churchgoers and promoting this embodied presence among churchgoers. So the backlash to this has been mainly the whole population who feels really invisible and unseen by that, who don't actually see church as a consumer product and do want desperately to belong and feel kind of passed over by that. So that would be kind of a summary.
Would anybody else like to add to that? Thank you, Jenna.
I would say that Tish Harrison Warren does really, I think, wrestle with the idea that it is kind of an obstacle that we have to face when really caring for the disabled and immunocompromised members of any faith congregation, and how churches, if they're going to be eliminating online services, do need to be making a special effort to reach and build community with disabled members of their congregation. So it is like she is calling us to go back to, like embodied physical church services, but she is also challenging the church to reach the homebound, the people who can't get to church, the people who are stuck there for one reason or another. So I think it's an interesting challenge, and perhaps something that some churches don't do very well.
Right.
I think that's really like the crux of the whole argument right here.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one of the reasons that I wanted to put this event together and that I wanted to have a conversation with all of you is I'm a big Tish Harrison Warren fan. Particularly the Liturgy of the Ordinary is one of the reasons I decided definitively to cross the Tiber and become Catholic. Its emphasis, though she's Anglican, its emphasis on embodied theology and the holiness of the everyday really resonated with me. And because I know that's something that is important to her as a writer and a thinker, I was not only in a little bit of disagreement with the original op-ed, but I was more than a little concerned about church response and the response of disability advocates who I respect that were, in my view, a little quick to jump to the conclusion that, oh, this is proof that the church doesn't care about disabled people, full stop. Like I feel like even if it's important, as we all just said, to have this conversation about the ways the church is falling short, caring for all of its members and all of their varied bodies, which I think we are all agreeing is the case, shouldn't we, as members of the same body, be a little bit more charitable and actually have a conversation instead of just retreating to our separate corners? So that's why I hope we're all here today. I did want to quote particularly one section from the Liturgy of the Ordinary that stuck with me that might help us get to some other places. In chapter 3, which is the chapter on brushing your teeth and kind of the first embodiment chapter, she writes, "Our lives are taken up with the care and maintenance of our bodies. We have to clean them, feed them, deal with their waste, exercise them, and give them rest again and again every day." And I think there's a lot going on in that short quote. It is about the cycles of bodies. We have to do these things over and over. It does, however, assume that everyone is cleaning themselves and feeding themselves and exercising themselves, which may or may not be the case for all bodies. So I wonder if we can unpack that a little bit more as it relates to church services and think about, have we seen certain congregations or certain movements include disabled people and acknowledge disabled bodies in ways that work. What are your experiences of that?
I mean, I have less experience than most on this panel, but my experience has been wholly positive, and not only for myself, but for others that I have known throughout the years and across different congregations who have been variously disabled. And it seems that the almost ordinary, if we're going off of Warren's piece as well, the almost ordinary injunction to care for your neighbor, but to be attentive towards it, towards your neighbor, and their needs, seems to have been the way that has been most helpful in all of those circumstances, whether it be me and my blindness, or aging related disabilities in some of my congregations, or one of my friend's brothers is severely disabled, and the way that his family and thereby the community around them included him, and was familiar. We're all familiar with what his particular noises, though strangers might consider them disruptive, how they recognize them as, oh, that's his expression of joy, or his expression of wanting to be included, and that sort of thing. But just a willingness in among the whole congregation, and a cultivation of an ethic that looks for ways to outdo one another in love, in caring for others, whether they're disabled or not, and fully including them in the participation of the community and the corporate worship of God.
I just want to acknowledge, sorry, go ahead.
I really like that you use the word cultivation there, because I think that is central, that we all have to do work to get to know each other. It's work to be vulnerable and share our experiences, and it's work to listen to, and to be able to decode the noises and all the things that you were saying. So thanks to everyone who did the work of giving us questions, and everyone who's in the chat right now. We see you and we appreciate you.
Yes, thank you, Brittany, for sharing that. I think that's a positive model of what could be. And I did want to acknowledge the several comments that came in with kind of the inverse experience there, as a number of caretakers for severely disabled partners or grandchildren, or what have you, who have felt really kind of unwelcome by the sort of disruptive nature of some of that, embodied existence, and that it's actually really important for congregations to welcome that, and to have that interaction, and to recognize those people as beloved children of God who deserve to be there.
Yeah, I think that's true. Oh, go ahead, Aimee.
Something that I think might be worth bringing to the table for this discussion and future discussions on disability inclusion in general is the medical model of disability versus the social model of disability, and how are we, like as a church, but also as a society, approaching disability? Is it as simply a lacking sort of thing, or is it a model of the beautiful diversity of God's creation? And that's like a hot, spicy topic of conversation, like both in and outside of the disability community, in academic circles and in activist circles. But I think when you start to view disability as something that, honestly, it's really a question of when for most people. Like if you make it to be old enough, it is a question of when, not a question of if.
Absolutely. Do you, I'm sure everyone on this call knows the work of Judy Heumann. She's basically the grandmother of the disability rights movement and one of my absolute idols. And Judy, when she gives interviews, refers to disabled people and non-disabled people rather than centering able-bodied people. And she does that for the reason that Aimee just brought up. She says, you know, you might not be there yet, but it's coming for all of you. So you might as well get used to that being the default, which I think is such a wonderful way to put that, to center the disabled experience a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. And I think perhaps one of the things to consider, like for the church and beyond, is that if we create a space where all disabled people and their disabled bodies are welcome and specifically included, you end up meeting the needs of everyone. Like you end up meeting the needs of the able-bodied people, of the mentally non-disabled people there, and you also create an environment and a culture that affirms the dignity of everyone instead of excluding people. So it gets interesting because as embodied people, I honestly tend to think that disabled members of our population are those who perhaps experience that embodiment most intensely, because we have to think about our bodies constantly.
Exactly. That brings up a point that we got in the pre-chat questions, and also that I think was raised in the response to the original op-ed that the New York Times published a week later, this notion of community embodiment and the idea that it's not as if online church is disembodied church. We're all occupying bodies all the time. And as you said quite astutely, Aimee, I think us as disabled people have a harder time forgetting that we're in bodies because our bodies won't let us forget that. It takes effort. We experience daily pain that sometimes others don't. People stare at me when I walk down the street, for example. In the first essay I published in Plow, I talk about this feeling of poetic justice I had when a child turned around so far to look at me that he himself fell down. And I felt a little bad for feeling bad. And then I was like, nah, it's fine. Because, you know, to turn the tables a little bit was a little bit delicious for me. Maybe that's bad. I don't know. But yes, we never forget that we're in these bodies, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I did want to say, I have loved reading Warren for a really long time, back to Liturgy of the Ordinary. From what you read, I had a passage that came back to me when we were preparing for this and talking about this. At one point, she says in Liturgy of the Ordinary, when we denigrate our bodies, whether through neglect or staring at our faces and counting up our flaws, we are belittling a sacred site, a worship space more wondrous and more glorious than the ancient cathedrals. We are standing before the Grand Canyon or the Sistine Chapel and rolling our eyes. And that passage, I read that book a few years ago, and I think that passage felt almost sacrilegious to me at the time, but I've since then kind of come to, I mean, it's been really formative for me in learning to kind of live in my own body and take it for what it is, as a gift, that it could be a creation, an intentional piece of nature that I steward in the midst of all kinds of fallenness and pain and inefficiency that comes with living in a disabled body in this world. But what I thought was fascinating in this context about that passage was the way that it calls bodies themselves worship spaces, that they are glorious cathedrals. And I wonder whether that is ever not true. I mean, whether you're at home or in the church building, you still have your body as a worship space. Like like we said, one of the dissenters in the thing that she published says homebound worshipers are still just as embodied. They just aren't embodied in a church. And so I think I wonder about this, whether there's something essentially formative about the church building, the church practices, the presence in the church, doing the Sunday morning church things that we're missing out on. Is this something that's essential for the formation of a Christian? Is this something that's just really good? It seems like we have some foundational questions that we want to ask about the nature of worship itself, the nature of bodies present in worship, and what you can and can't get out of a worship service and worshiping at home in just your body.
Yeah, and I think that Warren would agree with you that there's many things on sort of the spectrum of worship, including,
Absolutely.
washing your socks, right? Or brushing your teeth. But her piece seems to hinge on the idea that the public corporate worship of God's people on, the weekly Sunday or whatever it happens to be, there's something particularly special about the presence of God in that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that Zoom church or streaming services, whatever, don't cut the mustard. And therefore, though she doesn't take it this far, if I recall correctly, therefore, what we should be doing is bringing those who can't join, working as hard as we possibly can to bring those who can't join into that corporate worship. How? Not entirely certain, but if you have that principle there of cultivating that culture of helping one another, then it's almost like the rest is just details, and the details can get gritty, but the working out of the details just comes with that principle of intending to include all fully in the participation of the worship of God.
Yeah, on that note, Brittany, one of the really common themes that's coming through in the comments is a sense less of rejection than of simple invisibility to everyone around you. And it strikes me that the online option, although it may be very necessary and helpful for some people, really kind of exacerbates that if you don't see, if the rest of the congregation is not aware of the person on the other side of that. And so what would be helpful is some really practical tips to bridge that gap and bring everyone, whether online or off, more fully into the center of the community.
One thing that I one thing that I consistently come back to, and I can't speak for the other members of the panel, but in my own journey and decision making about whether or not to go back to attending in-person mass and other in-person liturgical services, is the congregation actively being inclusive and seeing the disabled members of their congregation, and not just seeing them, but also thinking about them in the context of this corporate worship. So, for example, I know that I have many friends in my neighborhood, in my Catholic community, who live near me, who attend a church that has really never enforced masking, and even through the worst parts of the pandemic with the highest death rates, has never enforced masking, and in fact has actively like their members have actively opposed vaccination, which kind of tells me as a disabled person that I'm not welcome there. Right. It means they're not considering my needs as someone with just like a really garbage immune system. So the fact that they're not even thinking about me is, you know, again, it connects to this level of invisibility. And so, you know, the option of online worship, sure, it does have that level of invisibility for, you know, those who are on the other side of the screen. But it gives us an option when the in-person facilities don't in any way consider us beyond maybe a handicap accessible ramp, like a wheelchair ramp to get in the building. You know, to this day, like the church that we've been going to, like, sure, like they encourage social distancing, but they don't enforce masking anymore either.
Something that what Aimee has said made me think of is maybe online services could force people to think about supplemental ways of gathering together. Because I think before, when we were in person, most of us didn't just attend church on Sunday or whatever the main 1 hour a week is. Most of us probably were on a prayer chain or in a Bible study or a small group or some kind of reading circle, community service. You know, churches aren't just that 1 hour on Sunday morning. So what other ways have we experienced, either prior to the pandemic or during, that have made us think differently about how community can exist for people who maybe can't attend church in person? Anybody have any ideas?
This is hard for me, like as a Catholic, because like our diocese has live streamed, or not live streamed, recorded mass at the cathedral every Sunday, and in fact potentially every day. I don't know how many times a week, but like those sorts of resources for disabled people and like the elderly who are homebound have existed since TV has been a thing. And my guess is that radio masses were probably also a thing when, you know, prior to TV, but when radio existed.
Yeah, Fulton Sheen and all that.
Right. And, you know, like Eucharistic ministers to the homebound have also been a thing, you know, for the history of the church. I think something that I really cherished and wish would exist more is just the presence of outdoor and like socially distanced services when you know, when dangerous pandemics happen. And that's also been happening for centuries. You know, there's documentation of outdoor masses happening during plagues in the Middle Ages. And, you know, like even during the Spanish flu, like outdoor masses happening in a city square, you know, while people were still ideally wearing masks and, you know, like being distanced from their other members of their community. But it was a safe way to like exist in this embodied space. And, you know, like one of the big statistics about COVID is that it's really hard to transmit when you're outdoors and you know, like socially distanced, like 6 feet away from each other. That outdoor spaces and highly ventilated spaces are a lot safer, particularly for the immunocompromised and disabled members of the community. So I thought that was a really creative thing that happened at the very beginning of the pandemic. And I feel like they got rid of it within about 6 to 8 months. And I missed it because it was a space where I felt safe, but I also got to participate like with other members of our congregation in a way that was meaningful and embodied and like physically present, despite the fact that, you know, like we had to be like, hey, you're over there and I'm over here, but hey, I'm glad to see you, you know, like I know there were like car confessions that were happening for other Catholic churches in our area. Like there were creative options that were being explored that seemed to me to be more inclusive and more friendly to those of us with compromised immune systems. And I would love to see more of that.
I'm curious where the duty of the church to a particular person, whether disabled or not, and the duty of the disabled person or not non-disabled person to seek out community, where those intersect, because it seems that each of us have it. So if you know your congregation, what would make you feel comfortable or safe were an outdoor something in your congregation didn't do that, could you, and I'm speaking to that in particular just because you mentioned it, not just to call you out, but is there a way for you to be like, hey, Father whomever, Pastor whomever, how can we make this happen? Have you found disinterest in that when you've brought it up? Or I'm not exactly sure what I'm asking, but it does seem to be that there is both a responsibility of, say, the helper to help and the responsibility of the person who needs help to ask for it when needed. And there's kind of like, you know, courtship, there's always like a muddy middle in there, and there's always some point where you're like, I've done everything, but at the same time it's always a two-way street, I guess.
I'll personally admit, I'm still not great about asking for help, and it's something that I'm learning about as like the fiercely independent kid, and like the kid who was always like, I played sports a lot in high school, who was literally like sacrificing my body to dive for a ball. Like I had no concept of bodily self-preservation at all until maybe 2 years ago, when my therapist was like, have you asked for help? Have you thought about like mentioning your needs to other people? And I was like,
it's hard.
What? I have to express needs and feel like a burden sometimes? What? And she was like, no, you're not a burden. Having needs is a human thing. So I'm not great about asking for that. And you're right, like I should definitely like reach out to at least like our parish and see, because it was something that they got rid of, you know, about 8 months into the pandemic. And I was sad to see it go, because I still didn't feel comfortable like going to like indoor events at that time. So
I really love that you guys have brought that up, because that's what I keep coming back to when I try to think about churches and accessibility, is like in all of my experiences, my best ones were times that I felt really seen and known and like cared for by a church. So like especially leadership, like when leadership will pay attention, ask questions, and then like act on very simple things that they know about me. It's like, a huge sigh of relief just to know that you're not the only person in the room looking out for your needs. And so, I mean, my access needs are not like really out of left, like they're roughly equivalent to like a very elderly person or like a super tired person. I don't know. So things like if I ever do like praying or speaking or singing from the front, people will bring me a chair to sit on, or just making sure it's not a super long distance to walk in any given place, or go grab me whatever handout or whatever it is. And what I was also thinking about is I am married to a very able-bodied man, and so much of my access needs are met because of him. And so I often think about single people who don't have that built-in person who's doing that for them. Like when I'm walking into a church building through a crowd of humans and small children who don't look where they're going, all of those things, he's there right beside me, making a way through a crowd, and he's there to help me find somewhere to sit down. He's there to go get the communion elements, all of those things. But what that really is just somebody who's attentive to me and who knows what I need. And anybody can have that. Like a really good thing to do as an able-bodied church member, I guess, the most practical thing I can think of is to get to know somebody and be a partner, like hang out, not like push yourself on this person, don't be weird, but like be available and let them reveal themselves to you as much as they want to, and accept as much help from you as they want to.
And ask them what they need, I think. I mean, often I've been interviewed several times about like the disabled experience during COVID, as if that is a monolithic thing. But when people ask me about that, I say it's twofold. One, seek out disabled voices, social media, in person, everywhere you can. And two, when they tell you what they experience, believe them. Like listen to what they're saying, listen to what they're telling you that they need. And I think that's something that you're hitting on too, the idea that anyone can make themselves available. And I think that feeling seen and known is so important. While you were talking, Jenna, I was thinking of something I experienced a couple of weeks ago. I'm a Stephen minister, which is a lay counseling one-on-one ministry where you're trained to walk alongside people who are going through difficult times, death, job loss, things like that. And I was in a training meeting, and the rest of our group was going to a different room downstairs. And my prayer partner, without drawing attention to herself, just kept walking with me around the corner to the elevator and let everybody else walk on. She didn't call attention to it. She just stayed with me and continued our conversation. But that quiet moment let me know that she was keeping me in mind. She knew I couldn't go that way and handled the stairs as well, and she went with me. So yeah, I felt like she really saw me in that moment, and those things are so important.
Yeah, I think the seeing aspect, it applies to websites as well. This makes sense, I swear. Because I come from, I was a theater marketer before I lost my sight, and so I think about marketing a lot, although I'm very much against marketing churches. But I do think it would help to have on the church website, which most churches have at this point, like a pretty readily visible button for accessibility, and like, hey, these are all the things that we do, but we also want to bring it. Really, if none of these needs meet your needs, let us know what they are. We want you here, that kind of thing, so that, and make it screen reader legible, so that those who are looking for a church to attend, especially in a new town or if they're visiting, that sort of thing, they know, oh, hey, this church would like me to be there. Real simple stuff.
One other thing that just popped into my mind as Brittany was talking is that I think a lot of churches view disabled people in a very paternalistic way, and kind of think that everyone who is disabled is not capable of making their own decisions, is in a conservatorship, like is not capable of participation, other than like just like receiving, you know, like whatever, like weekly worship service or whatever. And please understand, like, if you are part of a religious community, if you are a pastor or a priest or religious leader of some sort, please understand that there are disabled people who want to be more active in the ins and outs and daily life of your faith community. And for one reason or another, likely don't feel like they can. For me, you know, it has to do a lot with the fact that, like, I don't feel like I have enough spoons. You don't know what spoons are about, I'll look up spoon theory. Again, it's another hot, spicy topic within the disability community, but it's something that I relate to. Some other people refer to it as like spell slots from D&D. Basically,
I love
I
that.
have a limited amount of energy with my chronic pain and my fatigue, and how do I participate in the life of the church is something that I continually return to. Is there a level of participation for me that is going to respect my needs and my boundaries, but is also going to allow me to give what I can when I'm able? And so, like, not just putting disability information in a way that's like, oh, like, if you're able-bodied, you can serve as a minister to disabled people. It's like, no, how do we actually include the disabled people in the life of the church? Like, not just as a parental, like paternalistic sort of talking down to, but as co-creators of the faith community that we exist in.
Yes, absolutely. One of my favorite places ever, I used to live outside of Minneapolis, and we attended Mass every once in a while at this one church, St. Gabriel's. And I always felt really myself there and really at peace. And I could never figure out why until one day I had a wheelchair using Eucharistic minister, and I realized there is not a stair in this sanctuary. All the aisles are ramps. And I had internalized that in my brain because it was easier for me to get around. And so I felt more comfortable just in myself in the space. But I didn't actually, like, the penny didn't drop in my brain until I was like, oh, that wheelchair using minister just administered the Eucharist to me. And how amazing is that? And I love it so much. And no one said anything about it. He was just serving the body because he was in a space that allowed him to do that. And it was small and enormous all at the same time. Okay.
One thing that a commenter mentioned is that churches or religious institutions are actually not subject to the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the onus is really on them to do the right thing because they're not going to be legally required to do that. But something, Aimee, that you mentioned is that when you take a more inclusive posture, it ends up benefiting everybody. And I would say that as a non-disabled person, many of the accommodations that are made with disability in mind are actually really helpful to me as well. For example, as a mom, anywhere that a wheelchair can or can't go is where I can take a stroller or not take a stroller. And some of the kind of hybrid live stream options have been really beneficial to me too. Or the idea of outdoor services. We had a couple of those, and it's a great place to bring a kid to a service. So, and just like casting a wider, just an open mind and casting a wider net. You never know. You are just being more inclusive in general, and that is something that a number of the other commenters mentioned too, is that they have disabilities that aren't necessarily apparent to the eye, but so you wouldn't know that that's something that they're living with, but and just creating the path for them to be there, it really makes all the difference, like you were saying, Victoria.
Yeah, and I now have to prep for Sunday services by looking through the bulletin and grabbing the music and any creeds or whatever that I'm not super familiar with, and prepping that all in a document for me to use basically as my bulletin. But the fact that my congregation makes that bulletin available several days ahead of the service is also helpful for other people, especially for families with children, because I know a lot of the families in our church like to prep the kids with some of the songs. If they don't know the songs, they'll learn them over the weekend or what have you. And then someone else in my congregation she's losing hearing because of aging. So a sound system, I mean, it's so simple, but a sound system that is really good helps for that sort of thing. And it also helps when you have little children that are welcome in worship and they're being disruptive, and you can, because there's a good sound system, you can still hear the sermon, you can still hear other elements of the service. So it helps everybody. It's pretty great that way.
I've gotten through most of the questions we agreed on. Is there anything else that has come up while we were talking that any of you would like to mention?
I think I maybe just want to reiterate that I hear over and over again, even from us, how much embodied, like physical presence with other people in a church community does matter. I think that's the overall point of the article that brought us here. It's very well made and very well taken. And just feeling seen and heard as a disabled person by a church that wants me there means everything. And so online church or no, we want to be part of a community, whether we can show up or not show up. That's what we all want. And I think that's what churches want for us as well. And so that point of unity really is not disputed. And so these questions that we're all asking are really good ones to take home to our home churches and ask with the leadership and the people we're in community with. All of these things are good at our home churches, questions and conversations that keep going.
Absolutely, because the church isn't a building, right? The church is believers in the body of Christ. So I think this really is a conversation about community and how can we be a more attentive, actively listening, receptive community to each other.
A fun thing that our family, so it's just my husband and I and our dog. We've been experiencing infertility for like 9.5 years now, which is a huge bummer, and that's an understatement. But when we were struggling with the fact that a lot of the fellow Catholics in our neighborhood, were vehemently like anti-mask or anti-vax, we tried to figure out like, how are we called to community in this time when we're not feeling seen and heard by the members of our church who live near us. And one of the things that we kept coming back to was really like pushing back against this atomization of community through the focus on the nuclear family. And this is something, you know, we struggle with a lot because we don't have any kids to fill our home, and to add that, you know, like extra life and I think like sense of community to our own household. And so something that we asked was, how can we work towards that sense of family, but also like what needs do we have? And we actually have just welcomed two of my dear friends who I met through LGBT Christian circles, which I'm a part of, and invited them to come live with us, with the understanding that I am disabled and I need help doing things sometimes. And I have needs that, you know, like to an average person might feel like a burden, but I don't want to ever feel burdensome. And so like communicating all of these things with them, and, you know, communicating, you know, like we do want to be foster parents and we want to open our doors in hospitality that way as well. It's been so helpful, even though, you know, these two friends who we've welcomed aren't of the same faith background as us. And it's a way of living community in a way that the church is not meeting right now. And it's a community that we feel safe in, you know, because like early in the pandemic, we were, you know, like having like bubbles where like we just had one bubble with one other household in the neighborhood, and like it was safe, and you know, like we were all like only consistently seeing each other. And if we were seeing people outside of our bubble, we communicated that well. So now it's like we have invited these other adults into our home and like extended our bubble a little bit. But they're people who are also making like safe and life affirming choices for me as, you know, an immunocompromised person. And I think that's something that the church should consider, is like, how are the single people?
Yes.
How are, you know, families without children? Are they existing in community right now at all? And particularly for those single or elderly disabled people who don't have more than, you know, one other person living with them. You know, to me, that sounds awful. Like, it was just me and my husband for, you know, nearly 2 years of the pandemic. And we, you know, we've done great, and like our relationship has grown and thrived. But at the same time, I also recognize that just one person isn't enough community for most of us. I don't know if I want to say any of us, but, you know, certainly for most of us. And so there's just a lot to be thinking about in responding to disability and the needs of immunocompromised people in the age of COVID in the church. But there's also the needs of like single people and elderly people who are highly atomized in this world today because we don't have a strong sense of community and like co-living today, just because of single family homes and the idolization of the nuclear family. So I don't know, there's like so much to jump from, or to jump to from this conversation, when it comes to how are we being community as a church.
Aimee, there's an essay by Gil Meilander from many years ago that just pops into my mind all the time because of the title, which is "I Want to Be a Burden to My Loved Ones." And the idea there is we aren't meant to be atomized individuals, and It is often, these very vulnerabilities that bring us together to interact perhaps more closely than we may have anticipated, but it's to the good in the end. And as you mentioned before, it's really meant to go both ways, not only because if you aren't disabled now, you very likely will be at some point in your life, but also there's an important role for everyone to play in the life of each church and in each other's lives now. Did anybody have other final thoughts before we close out the evening?
I just want to thank everybody for coming, not only everyone who's listening, but you ladies for speaking and sharing your experiences tonight. I don't think I've ever had a conversation with this many disabled women in one space, and that is such a blessing to me. Like I'm so happy to have had a conversation where my experiences were acknowledged and reflected back to me in this way. So thank you all so much for being here.
Yes, and thank you everyone for watching and participating. And we'll definitely be keeping your comments on our hearts as we go forward. Good night.